Imagine starting your morning with a walk to the public baths. Sounds majestic? Yes. Clean and relaxing, not even close. Bathing in ancient Rome was not a spa experience. There was no scented soap, no private water. And yes, you had to share the pool with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of other people, from senators to slaves. And the water? Rarely changed. Bathhouses like the Thermae of Caracalla or the Baths of Diocletian were architectural wonders. Towering columns, sparkling mosaics, pools of hot and cold water, and even saunas. But don't be fooled. Behind the grandeur was a reality far from hygienic. The water in public baths was often unsanitized. Filtration technology didn't exist. The only filtering system was water flowing in from aqueducts, or more often, not replaced at all until it looked too murky to ignore. With so many people using the baths daily, you can imagine how much sweat, body oil, dead skin, and, well, other things floated around in that water. And let's talk about the sponge. In public toilets, Romans used a communal sponge on a stick to clean themselves. After use, the sponge was rinsed in vinegar water and reused. No toilet paper, no soap, just a stick and an unfortunate cycle of bacterial roulette. We haven't even gotten to athlete's foot, fungal infections, or skin diseases that thrived in such an environment. Roman doctors like Galen often wrote about these ailments. The culprit? More often than not, the public baths. Yet bathing was a social event. You could network, talk politics, listen to poetry, even enjoy live performances. But forget about privacy, because it didn't exist. Bathing nude among crowds was the norm. There were separate hours for men and women, but often they overlapped. That meant crowds, noise, and utter chaos. Interestingly, elite citizens brought private slaves to scrub them with olive oil and scrape it off with a strigil, a curved metal tool. It was considered elegant, but it didn't mean you got clean. You just moved the dirt around. Bathhouses had different rooms: hot, caldarium; warm, tepidarium; and cold, frigidarium. Switching between these was supposed to stimulate circulation, at least in theory. In practice, the extreme temperature changes often caused people to faint, especially those who were undernourished or exhausted from a hard day's labor. Fainting in the bathhouse wasn't uncommon. So if you thought bathing in ancient Rome was relaxing and refreshing, think again. It was more like a mix between a crowded gym, a public pool with no filters, and a packed train station at rush hour. Oh, and you had to walk home afterward in wet sandals, slick skin covered in leftover oil, and maybe with a brand new case of athlete's foot as a souvenir. Welcome to Rome. Let's be honest, no one dreams of history for its toilets. But if you ever feel nostalgic about the ancient world, just remember this: the Romans pooped together, literally, in rows, on stone benches. Public latrines were a common feature in Roman cities. Dozens of holes lined long stone seats with no partitions, no doors, and certainly no privacy. You sat next to your neighbor, did your business, and maybe chatted about politics or the weather while doing so. It was democracy for your digestive system. And the smell? Think warm weather, poor sewage systems, and dozens of people sharing a single room with a flowing trench of waste beneath. Roman engineering did allow for a continuous stream of water beneath the latrines to carry away waste, but that didn't prevent stench from rising up like a ghost of your lunch. Then came the infamous sponge on a stick, the tersorium. Instead of toilet paper, which wouldn't exist for centuries, Romans used a communal sponge, dipped it in vinegar or salty water, wiped themselves, then put it back for the next person. Hygiene? Questionable. Disease risk? Extremely high. Historians believe the spread of intestinal parasites, bacterial infections, and other diseases was common in these settings. You can imagine why. And yet, this was considered normal, even civilized, by Roman standards. To make things worse, Roman toilets were often a place where vermin, especially rats and insects, thrived. Some toilets were known to have occasional surges of flames caused by built-up methane gas. Yes, flaming toilets. There are even records of people being bitten by snakes hiding in the sewage system. For the wealthy, having a private toilet at home was a luxury, but even those weren't immune to the problems. Without a flush system, waste was collected and either dumped into the street or removed manually. If you lived above the ground floor in an insula, apartment building, the waste might be casually tossed out the window with or without warning. And yet, these communal toilets were social hubs. Romans didn't view bathroom time as private. It was public, shared, and even polite conversation was expected. Imagine going to the bathroom with 20 strangers while making small talk about tax policy. That was Tuesday in ancient Rome. The experience was so ingrained in daily life that public latrines often included decorative mosaics and jokes carved into the walls, essentially the ancient world's bathroom graffiti. Some were clever, others crude, but all served to pass the time while waiting your turn. So next time you flush a toilet in peace, thank modern plumbing. And remember, in ancient Rome, using the bathroom wasn't just personal, it was practically performance art. Life in ancient Rome was anything but peaceful. While the Romans are often celebrated for their architectural marvels, impressive public works, and sophisticated political system, the everyday reality for ordinary citizens was a cacophony of noise and chaos that made restful living nearly impossible. From dawn until well past dusk, the city roared with the sounds of its bustling population, street vendors hawking their goods, construction workers hammering away, and the constant clatter of carts and chariots on the uneven stone streets. This wasn't just the background hum of a lively metropolis. It was a relentless assault on the senses, a constant reminder that rest and quiet were luxuries few could afford. The relentless hustle of the streets. The streets of Rome were a maze of narrow alleys and crowded thoroughfares where thousands of people and animals jostled for space. Merchants called out loudly to advertise fresh produce, meats, and other wares, competing for attention amid the crowd's chatter. Bakers, fishmongers, and cloth sellers all added to the din, their voices sometimes rising into heated arguments or bargaining matches. Add to this the noise of animals, donkeys braying, dogs barking, horses neighing, as well as the clang of blacksmiths' hammers shaping iron tools and weapons. Construction projects were constant, with laborers building new homes, aqueducts, or public baths, their pounding and sawing echoing through the city. Nighttime did not bring much relief. Although the streets emptied somewhat after sunset, the city's taverns and inns came alive with laughter, music, and rowdy crowds. Drunken brawls and shouting matches were common, especially near the city's many forums and entertainment venues. Sleep was hard to come by, especially for those living close to busy marketplaces or taverns. Noise pollution and its impact on health. Modern studies show that constant exposure to noise can lead to stress, anxiety, and sleep disturbances, conditions that the average Roman citizen likely experienced daily. Yet, the Romans had no real concept of noise pollution or urban planning aimed at reducing it. The idea of zoning or soundproofing was centuries away. The average Roman apartment or insula was a poorly constructed, multi-story wooden structure that magnified sounds rather than muffling them. Walls were thin, floors creaked underfoot, and the noise from neighbors, children playing, couples arguing, slaves working, traveled freely between units. Imagine trying to sleep with the cacophony of the street outside, the clamor of dozens of families within the building, and the shrill cries of street vendors just beyond the window. The role of festivals and public events. Rome's calendar was packed with festivals, religious ceremonies, and public games that, while culturally important, added to the city's noise and chaos. Events like the Saturnalia, the Ludi Romani, or gladiator games at the Colosseum were occasions for loud celebrations, fireworks, and huge crowds. Streets would be packed shoulder to shoulder, bands and choirs performing, and sometimes even wild animals paraded through the city, each event creating days or even weeks of non-stop noise. For those who lived near the forum or major public arenas, these events meant prolonged disruption to any semblance of daily routine or peace. The curse of crowded living Roman insulae were densely packed with people, often dozens of families per building, sometimes more. Sanitation was poor, and the overcrowding meant that noise was amplified and constant. Neighbors were in close quarters, and there was little privacy. The thin walls meant every conversation, every shout, and every cry was heard by the entire floor. Children ran through hallways, slaves moved about with heavy loads, and residents argued loudly over the smallest matters. At night, the noise of snoring, coughing, and restless tossing in beds echoed through these buildings. Complaints about noise were common but usually ignored or dismissed due to the lack of alternative housing. Fire, crime, and the nighttime danger. The noise didn't just come from day-to-day activities, it was also a symptom of constant danger. Fires were a terrifying hazard in the insulae, and fire alarms were virtually non-existent. When a fire broke out, screams and cries for help added to the city's chaotic soundscape. The poorly lit streets at night were hotspots for thieves, muggers, and other criminals. The screams and shouts of victims, the footsteps of fleeing perpetrators, and the calls of watchmen patrolling the city contributed to the sleepless nights of Romans. Many simply avoided going out after dark, but for those without secure homes, the dangers were unavoidable. Chapter 4. Wooden apartments on the edge. The danger of the insulae. One of the defining features of ancient Rome's urban landscape was the insulae, the multi-story apartment blocks that housed most of the city's lower and middle classes. While these towering buildings were essential to accommodate Rome's exploding population, they were a nightmare in terms of safety, comfort, and hygiene. The rise of the insulae. Rome's population swelled to over 1 million by the 1st century AD, making it the largest city in the ancient world. To cope with this massive influx, Romans built insulae that often rose 5 or 6 stories high, an impressive feat for the time, but also a disaster waiting to happen. These buildings were mostly constructed from wood and mud bricks, materials highly flammable and structurally unstable. Unlike the sturdy stone homes of the wealthy elite, insulae were cramped and hastily built. Rooms were tiny and poorly ventilated, stairways narrow and steep. Many tenants had little access to clean water or proper sanitation. The cheapest units, often those at the top floors, were dark, damp, and shoddily maintained. Fire hazards and frequent disasters. The greatest threat to the residents of the insulae was fire. Wooden beams, open flames for lighting and cooking, and the close proximity of units created the perfect conditions for rapid fire spread. When a blaze started, it often engulfed entire blocks in minutes. Historical records describe massive fires devastating parts of Rome, such as the Great Fire of 64 AD during Emperor Nero's reign, which destroyed large swaths of the city, including many insulae. Firefighting techniques were primitive. Bucket brigades and basic pumps were barely effective, and many residents were trapped or forced to leap from upper floors to escape the flames. Structural instability and collapse. Beyond fire, the insulae were prone to structural failure. Overcrowding, poor construction materials, and lack of maintenance meant that walls and floors could collapse without warning. There are accounts of entire buildings crumbling, killing dozens of inhabitants in a matter of moments. Because the upper floors were the cheapest and housed the poorest residents, they were often the most dangerous. People living on these levels faced not only greater risk of collapse, but also had to endure higher temperatures in summer and colder conditions in winter, since heating and insulation were minimal. Overcrowding and living conditions. Many insulae housed entire families squeezed into a single room, sharing communal latrines and water sources. The overcrowded conditions contributed to the rapid spread of disease and made privacy almost impossible. Noise, smells, and filth permeated every corner. Despite these hardships, many Romans had no choice but to live in insulae due to the lack of affordable alternatives. Wealthier citizens mocked these vertical slums and often looked down on their residents as lower class or even dangerous. Attempts at regulation. The Roman government occasionally tried to regulate insulae construction to prevent fires and collapses. Some emperors introduced laws requiring wider streets to act as fire breaks or mandated communal water access points for firefighting, but these efforts were only partially successful. The chaotic, densely packed nature of Rome's urban core made safety improvements difficult. Chapter 5. Lightless Nights. The perilous darkness of ancient Rome extended. Life in ancient Rome was ruled by the sun. As daylight faded, the sprawling city, with its narrow alleys and crowded insulae, slipped into a deep, enveloping darkness that transformed the familiar into a treacherous unknown. The absence of an effective and widespread lighting system was more than an inconvenience. It shaped the rhythms, fears, and behaviors of the Roman population in profound ways. The technology and cost of lighting. The primary sources of artificial light in ancient Rome were oil lamps, lucernae, and torches. Oil lamps were typically small containers made of clay or bronze, filled with olive oil or animal fat, and equipped with a wick made from linen or papyrus. Their light output was weak and flickering, barely illuminating a small room. Torches, made by soaking wooden sticks in pitch or resin, burned brighter but consumed fuel quickly and produced thick smoke. These sources were costly relative to the average Roman's income, especially for the poorer classes crammed into the insulae. Lighting a single lamp required valuable oil, and many families economized by limiting their use to essential activities after dark. For the lowest classes, darkness was a forced condition. Many would simply go to bed soon after sunset. The absence of street lighting and its consequences. Unlike some other ancient cities, Rome did not have a public street lighting system. There is scant evidence that any systematic installation of lamps or torches existed to light the city's streets. While certain wealthy neighborhoods, temples, or public buildings might have displayed lamps or braziers in front of their entrances, the majority of the city's labyrinthine alleys and main roads remained unlit. This darkness had immediate consequences. Crime thrived in the shadows. With streets cloaked in darkness, criminals found ample opportunity to attack unsuspecting victims. Robbery, mugging, and violent assault were common, especially in narrow alleys and areas away from busy marketplaces. The poor and women were particularly vulnerable to harassment and violence after dark. While Rome did have a rudimentary night watch, vigils, their numbers and resources were insufficient to patrol the entire city effectively. Fear and social behavior. The darkness shaped social norms. Many Romans avoided venturing outside after nightfall, restricting their movements to necessary tasks. Public baths, theaters, and markets closed at dusk, cutting off much of the city's social life to daylight hours. Taverns and private parties continued indoors with lamps, but these were spaces mostly accessible to the more affluent. Accidents and fire risks. The dimness caused frequent accidents. Uneven cobblestones, open drains, cloacae, and narrow staircases became hazardous obstacles. A misstep could lead to injury or worse. Moreover, oil lamps and torches, precariously balanced on wooden furniture or carried through narrow stairwells, were common sources of fire. Flames could easily spread to the wooden insulae and cause devastating blazes, especially since fires often went unnoticed until well underway due to lack of illumination. The Roman night watch and its limitations. The Vigiles Urbani were the official night watchmen of Rome, formed during Augustus's reign around 6 AD. Their primary duties included firefighting, maintaining public order at night, and patrolling the city's streets. They carried lanterns and were armed, but their force was small compared to the vast population and area they needed to cover. Often overwhelmed, The vigils struggled to prevent petty crime and were largely reactive, responding to incidents rather than proactively deterring them. Corruption and lack of training further limited their effectiveness. Citizens were advised to travel in groups and avoid the streets alone at night, advice that highlights how dangerous darkness was perceived. Psychological effects of darkness and sleep deprivation. The nightly darkness in Rome wasn't just a physical threat. It had psychological consequences. The ancient Romans were a deeply superstitious people, and darkness was associated with ghosts, demons, and the supernatural. The unknown dangers lurking in shadows heightened anxieties and contributed to insomnia. Many Romans reportedly suffered from sleep disorders, partly due to the constant stress of city life and the fear of night dangers. In cramped and noisy insulae, sleep was frequently interrupted by disturbances, arguments, or emergencies like fires. The mental toll of such living conditions is difficult to quantify, but likely significant. Attempts at lighting improvements. There are few records of attempts to improve nighttime lighting, but some wealthy individuals and public institutions lit their homes, temples, and public spaces with ornate bronze oil lamps. Some streets near important buildings might have been lit for ceremonial purposes or during special events. However, the cost and logistical difficulties prevented widespread adoption of street lighting. It would take many centuries before the idea of city lighting as a public service became widespread in urban design. Chapter 6. Threats from Within. Political Violence and the Mad Emperors. Ancient Rome's political landscape was as brutal and chaotic as its noisy streets. For ordinary Romans, the real dangers often came not only from crime or fire, but from the volatile power struggles and caprices of those who ruled the empire. The shadow of political violence. Rome was a city where political violence was normalized. From the late Republic era into the empire, street gangs and political factions openly clashed in the forums and public spaces. Assassinations, riots, and purges were common tactics used by politicians and their supporters to consolidate or challenge power. For the average citizen, this translated into instability and fear. Public order could collapse overnight during factional fighting. Markets and businesses were disrupted, and innocents often caught in the crossfire. The rise of the emperors. Power concentrated in one man. With the fall of the Republic and the rise of the imperial system under Augustus, power became concentrated in the hands of a single ruler, the emperor. While this brought relative stability in some periods, it also exposed the population to the whims of emperors whose mental health or cruelty could wreak havoc. Some emperors were infamous for their paranoia, madness, or cruelty, such as Caligula, Nero, and Commodus. These rulers' erratic decisions often led to mass executions, confiscations of property, and violent purges that terrorized the population. Caligula, the mad tyrant. Caligula, who ruled from AD 37 to 41, is one of history's most notorious mad emperors. Stories of his bizarre behavior include declaring himself a god, ordering the execution of innocent senators, and indulging in extreme cruelty. His reign created an atmosphere of fear. No one knew who might be next to fall victim to his whims. The common people lived under the constant threat of arbitrary violence, never certain if a public event would turn into a deadly spectacle or if a neighbor might suddenly vanish. Nero and the Great Fire. Nero's reign, AD 54-68, was marked by excess, artistic obsession, and cruelty. His handling of the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, which devastated large parts of the city, remains controversial. Rumors that he started the fire to clear space for his grand palace added to his infamy. After the fire, Nero blamed and persecuted Christians, leading to brutal executions. His extravagant spending and heavy taxation to fund building projects also burdened the common people. The constant fear of purges and betrayal. Political purges under various emperors meant that anyone, even high-ranking officials or wealthy citizens, could be arrested, tortured, or executed on suspicion of treason or conspiracy. Informants and spies lurked in the city, encouraging distrust and paranoia among neighbors and families. This oppressive atmosphere made everyday life a minefield of uncertainty. People avoided political discussions, guarded their words carefully, and lived with the fear that their status or property could be stripped away overnight. Ancient Rome was famed for its architectural marvels, sprawling cities, and military conquests. But beneath the grandeur and spectacle lay an economic system that often strangled its most vulnerable citizens, the plebeians, freedmen, and lower classes. Taxes, in their many forms, were relentless and oppressive, a daily weight that could push families to ruin. The complexity and scope of Roman taxation. The Roman taxation system was complex, multifaceted, and evolved over centuries. Unlike modern governments that rely largely on income or sales taxes, Roman taxes were levied in a patchwork of direct and indirect forms. Tributum, direct tax. Originally a military tax levied on Roman citizens during the Republic, it became a regular property tax under the Empire. This tax was based on land ownership and assessed property values, but enforcement was uneven and often unfair, hitting the poor harder. Centesima rerum venalium, sales tax. A 1% tax on goods sold at auction, affecting merchants and traders. Portoria, customs duties. Taxes on goods crossing provincial borders or entering ports, increasing the price of imported goods. Inheritance taxes. Introduced by Augustus, these taxes hit families upon death, cutting into what little wealth could be passed down. Poll taxes and special levies, applied on certain groups or regions, especially in provinces, often to fund military campaigns or imperial projects. Each of these taxes combined to place a heavy fiscal burden on ordinary Romans who struggled to keep up with multiple demands. Tax farming, the system's most corrupt and brutal aspect. Perhaps the most destructive feature of Roman taxation was the system of publicani, or tax farmers. Instead of the state directly collecting taxes, the government often auctioned off tax collection rights to private contractors. These publicani paid the government up front for the right to collect taxes in a province or district, then squeeze the taxpayers to maximize their profits. Tax farmers were infamous for their cruelty and corruption. They imposed excessive levies, used intimidation and violence to extract payments, and exploited loopholes. Many rural farmers, tradespeople, and urban dwellers found themselves at the mercy of these collectors, sometimes paying several times more than the official rates. Impact on the rural population and urban poor. For peasants and rural farmers, tax season was a nightmare. Because much of their wealth was tied to land and crops, they were forced to give up a significant portion of their harvest to the tax collectors, failed to pay, and they risked losing their land or being enslaved for debt. In the city, the urban poor faced a different but equally grim reality. Taxes increased the prices of food and goods. Market vendors passed on customs duties and sales taxes to consumers. Combined with high rents for cramped insulae and the rising cost of essentials, many city dwellers struggled to afford basic necessities. Taxes to fund endless wars and imperial ambitions. The tax burden wasn't arbitrary. Much of the revenue went to fund Rome's vast military machine and imperial ambitions. The empire's borders were constantly under threat, requiring expensive armies, fortifications, and logistics. To finance wars, from Germania to Britannia, from Judea to Parthia, emperors levied new taxes or increased existing ones. During times of crisis, such as after major rebellions or natural disasters, tax demands could spike dramatically, crushing the economy of ordinary families. Social unrest and tax revolts. The unbearable weight of taxation led to frequent social unrest. Throughout Roman history, multiple tax revolts and peasant uprisings erupted in various provinces and even within Italy itself. For example, the Baccaudi revolts in Gaul and Hispania in the 3rd century AD were partly fueled by oppressive taxes and corruption. In Egypt and North Africa, heavy taxation combined with famine and disease sparked violent resistance. In the city of Rome, economic stress from taxes contributed to periodic riots and unrest, especially among the plebeians who bore the brunt of fiscal exploitation. The psychological toll of economic oppression. Beyond the material hardship, the constant pressure of taxation had deep psychological effects. Families lived in fear of tax collectors, struggling with debt and economic instability. The inability to escape the tax net, which seemed to grow ever tighter, eroded hope and fueled resentment toward the state. For many, taxation was not just a fiscal matter, but a symbol of their subjugation to a distant and uncaring imperial authority. Chapter 8. The Endless Draft, Military Service and the Perpetual Wars of Rome. For most ancient Romans, the glory of the empire was a distant ideal overshadowed by the harsh realities of military service. Rome's expansion and defense relied on an army that demanded a near-constant supply of manpower, which translated into a relentless burden on its citizen soldiers and their families. The military as a civic duty, and a burden military service in Rome, was theoretically a duty and honor for all male citizens, especially those owning property sufficient to equip themselves. From the Republic through the early Empire, Roman citizens aged roughly between 17 and 46 were liable for conscription. Initially, service was seasonal and limited to campaigns during the warmer months. However, as Rome expanded its borders and faced increasingly frequent conflicts, military service became a full-time, career-long commitment for many. Men were often away from home for years, fighting in distant provinces or on foreign frontiers. This absence strained families and local economies, especially in rural areas dependent on manual labor for farming. The strain of endless campaigns. Rome's borders were vast and volatile. The empire stretched from Britain in the northwest to Egypt in the southeast, from the Atlantic coast to the Mesopotamian deserts. This sprawling domain required continuous military presence to suppress rebellions, deter invasions, and enforce imperial control. Wars were nearly constant, whether defensive campaigns against Germanic tribes, punitive expeditions in Gaul, quelling uprisings in Judea, or battling Parthians in the east. The army was never truly at rest. This perpetual state of warfare meant that men were regularly drafted, sometimes multiple times over their lifetimes. Veterans rarely returned to peaceful civilian life, as new conflicts demanded fresh deployments. Life as a legionary, hardships, and discipline. Life in the Roman legions was brutal. Soldiers endured grueling marches, harsh climates, inadequate supplies, and the constant threat of battle. Discipline was strict, with severe punishments for infractions ranging from flogging to execution. Camp life was austere. Legionaries built their own fortifications and lived in cramped, often unsanitary conditions. Disease and injury were common, and medical care rudimentary. Despite these hardships, legionaries received pay, a share of spoils, and the promise of land grants or pensions upon retirement. Yet for many, the physical and psychological toll outweighed the rewards. The impact on families and communities. The mass conscription drained the rural workforce. With able-bodied men away, farms and businesses suffered. Wives, elderly relatives, and children were left to maintain homesteads, often without adequate labor. Economic hardship and social instability increased as communities lost their young men to war. Orphans and widows grew in number, and the social fabric strained under the weight of continuous military demands. Moreover, military service exposed soldiers to brutal violence and moral dilemmas, which could haunt them long after returning home, if they survived. The role of slaves and allies in warfare. While citizen soldiers formed the backbone of Rome's legions, the empire increasingly relied on allied troops, auxiliaries, and sometimes slaves for military manpower. Provinces were required to provide soldiers, and auxiliary units composed of non-citizens fought alongside Roman legions. Slaves were sometimes forced into combat roles, particularly in emergencies. Gladiators, trained fighters, originally slaves or criminals, could be pressed into service. This reliance reflected both Rome's military needs and the limits of its citizen population. However, it also complicated loyalties and added tension to imperial rule. Political and social consequences of military service. Military service was a key factor in Roman citizenship and political life. Veterans often formed influential social groups and were rewarded with privileges. However, conscription could be exploited by emperors and generals to enforce loyalty or suppress dissent. Large armies raised from the provinces could be used for internal power struggles, coups, or civil wars, turning soldiers into political tools rather than defenders of the state. The endless warfare and conscription also fostered resentment among the population, who bore the costs of empire building without always sharing its benefits. Chapter 9. Slavery and the threat of becoming a gladiator, living under the shadow of chains and the arena. In ancient Rome, slavery was not merely an economic institution, but a brutal reality that permeated every aspect of society. For millions, freedom was a distant dream, and the constant threat of bondage or being forced into the deadly gladiatorial arena loomed large. This chapter delves into the harsh world of slavery and the chilling fear many faced of becoming a gladiator. Spectacles that entertained the masses but were soaked in blood and suffering. The omnipresence of slavery in Roman life. Slavery was foundational to Rome's economy and society. Slaves were everywhere, in households, farms, workshops, mines, and even in the imperial bureaucracy. Estimates suggest that during the height of the empire, slaves constituted between 20% to 30% of the population. Unlike later historical forms of slavery, Roman slavery was not race-based, but a status imposed largely by conquest, debt, or birth. Prisoners of war, rebels, criminals, and sometimes even children sold by impoverished families could be enslaved. Slaves were considered property, devoid of personal rights, subjected to their master's absolute control. Their lives were marked by hard labor, deprivation, and constant fear. The brutal reality of slave labor. Roman slaves worked in a staggering variety of roles. Domestic slaves served as cooks, cleaners, tutors, and personal attendants, often experiencing somewhat better conditions, but remaining vulnerable to abuse. In contrast, agricultural slaves endured backbreaking labor in fields and vineyards, often under harsh overseers. Even worse were slaves condemned to the mines or quarries, where deadly conditions led to short life expectancies. Craftsmen slaves operated workshops producing goods for Rome's booming markets. Some skilled slaves could earn a measure of respect or even buy their freedom, but such cases were exceptions. Despite these variations, the overall reality was one of oppression and exploitation. Physical punishment, torture, and sexual abuse were common, and slaves lived with constant uncertainty about their fate. The fearsome fate of gladiators. Among the most dreaded destinies for slaves was being forced to become a gladiator. Gladiatorial combat was a popular form of entertainment, drawing large crowds to the arenas. Gladiators were often slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals trained to fight to the death. Some volunteered, lured by the promise of fame or freedom, but most were coerced or forced into the role. Training was rigorous and brutal. Gladiators learned combat skills and were kept under strict discipline. Despite their status, successful gladiators could achieve celebrity, but their lives remained perilous, with death always a possibility in the arena. The social and psychological impact of gladiatorial combat. Gladiatorial games were a double-edged sword. For the ruling elite, they were a tool to appease the masses and demonstrate power. For slaves and gladiators, they were a symbol of dehumanization and mortality. The games glorified violence and death, normalizing brutality as public spectacle. Slaves forced into the arena faced not only physical danger but also the humiliation of fighting for survival under the gaze of thousands. Families of slaves lived in fear, knowing their loved ones could be sold or condemned to the arena at any moment. Slave rebellions and resistance. Despite their oppressed status, slaves were not passive victims. Throughout Rome's history, there were notable slave revolts, the most famous being the Spartacus Rebellion, 73-71 BC. Spartacus, a gladiator himself, led a massive uprising that challenged Rome's power for years. Though ultimately crushed, the revolt exposed the underlying tensions and brutality of the slave system. Smaller acts of resistance were common: sabotage, escape attempts, work slowdowns, and subtle defiance. Manumission, the elusive dream of freedom. Some slaves could earn or buy their freedom, manumission, often through long service, special favor, or skilled labor. Freedmen gained limited rights and could participate in economic and social life, but the stigma of former servitude lingered. Despite manumission, the threat of losing freedom remained for many, as laws and social norms kept freedmen subordinate to freeborn citizens. In the mighty Roman Empire, the concept of lex, the law, was held as a cornerstone of civilization. Romans prided themselves on having a structured legal system that distinguished them from barbarians. But for the average citizen, or worse, the enslaved and the poor, Roman justice often felt less like a beacon of fairness and more like an iron fist, cruel, theatrical, and heavily tilted toward the powerful. The law favors the few. Rome's laws were written by the elite and for the elite. While the 12 Tables, Rome's earliest codification of law in 451 BC, laid the groundwork for a seemingly equitable legal system, the actual practice was anything but fair. Legal representation was available only to those who could afford it, which meant that justice itself was effectively for sale. Wealthy patricians and senators could manipulate trials, bribe officials, or leverage influence to avoid punishment altogether. The poor, on the other hand, were often convicted without proper defense. Worse still, punishment for the same crime varied wildly based on one's social class. A patrician caught stealing might pay a fine. A plebeian could be flogged. A slave, crucifixion. Punishments designed to terrify. Roman punishments were engineered not just to discipline, but to terrify both the condemned and the watching crowd. Crucifixion was among the most feared. Reserved for slaves, rebels, and the worst criminals, it was intentionally slow and agonizing, often performed publicly along roadsides to deter others. Damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts, involved criminals being torn apart by wild animals in front of roaring crowds at the Colosseum. Lions, bears, and leopards were star performers in this macabre theater. Beatings and floggings with whips embedded with metal were common. For certain offenses, the condemned would be scourged until unconscious or dead. Decimation, a military punishment, saw 1 in every 10 soldiers executed at random when a unit was found guilty of cowardice or mutiny. These were not hidden punishments. They were staged performances. Public executions became mass entertainment, bloody theater that mingled justice with spectacle, vengeance with pleasure. Crime and paranoia. Roman laws reflected the constant paranoia of the ruling class. Political dissent, satire, or even vague rumors could lead to execution, exile, or confiscation of property. Under emperors like Nero or Caligula, this paranoia reached absurd levels. Simply being associated with someone accused of treason could result in one's arrest or death. Maestas, treason, was such a broadly defined crime that disagreeing with the emperor in private conversation could cost a person their life. Even common offenses like theft or debt could lead to severe punishment. Debtors were sometimes imprisoned or enslaved. Petty thieves could lose limbs or be branded with hot irons. torture as evidence. In Roman legal practice, the truth was often beaten out of people. Torture wasn't just punishment, it was part of the evidence-gathering process. Slaves, in particular, were considered incapable of telling the truth unless under torture. If a master was accused of a crime, their slaves would be tortured en masse to reveal the truth. It didn't matter if the evidence extracted was unreliable or fabricated under duress. What mattered was preserving social order. For free citizens, confessions under torture could still be used, especially if the accused belonged to a marginalized group or lacked political protection. This system created a culture of fear, where silence was often the only defense. Public executions as morbid entertainment. Rome didn't just use punishment to correct behavior, it used it to entertain and dominate. Executions were often held in the morning hours at the arena, preceding the gladiator fights. Crowds cheered as criminals were dismembered, crucified, or fed to wild beasts. For Roman citizens, especially the urban poor, these executions offered free entertainment and a brutal lesson in obedience. Over time, the lines between justice and spectacle blurred completely. The arena became a place where morality, legality, and cruelty all bled into one. Justice was a weapon of the powerful. Rome's legal system was a reflection of its society, hierarchical, ruthless, and unequal. Justice could be swift and brutal, or conveniently delayed, depending on one's status and political connections. Governors in the provinces had almost unlimited power over locals and could pass judgment with little oversight. Appeals to the emperor existed, but they were slow and rarely favored the average petitioner. Even within Rome, verdicts were often determined by politics, not truth. Trials became tools for revenge, public shaming, or elimination of rivals. If you were poor, enslaved, or a foreigner, justice was something done to you, not something you participated in. Like this kind of brutal, boring, but strangely fascinating history? Want more tales of ancient absurdity that make you grateful to be alive in modern times? Subscribe to the YouTube channel Rifki Muljana for more sleepy, savage, and surreal history content. Perfect for late nights, curiosity cravings, and realizing how weird the past really was. Because in the Roman Empire, justice wasn't boring, it was horrifyingly entertaining. Don't miss the next twisted tale. Hit that subscribe button now